I'm going to kick things off here at the beginning and kind of walk y'all, give you a real quick 5-10 minute overview of what the project pipeline program is. Next slide. First, I wanted to start off with the program purpose and goals. So the project pipeline study program, the intent is really to focus on the priorities that the CTB establishes through the VTrans multimodal plan. A couple other objectives is really looking for ways to streamline project planning. Oftentimes studies can take a really long time. We sort of reinvent the wheel each time we do them. And so the plan here is to have a more repeatable process that we can use. Let's pull all the data in, come up with a way to quickly analyze it so that we can get studies done. We can reduce the cost, but also the time to deliver them. As we know, we've got limited transportation dollars, so we wanted a performance-based approach that looks at understanding what the problem is, what the issues are, and then going through and deliberately testing various alternatives to try to move the needle in that performance. Next slide. This fits in with the programs at the statewide level that you're aware of. So you've got VTrans establishes the needs and priorities. Smart Scale is a funding program that folks go after. And then we've got a performance reporting where we report on trends, performance, how are we doing from a safety standpoint, from a congestion standpoint. And it's this feedback loop. And really what Project Pipeline is intended to do is provide that connection between the document or the plan that establishes what the problems are in the state and making sure that we're feeding cost-effective solutions over into Smart Scale as best we can. There are a lot of other study programs, and we really base this off of the good work that VDOT's been doing over the last decade with the STARS program, just looking to focus specifically a similar type study program on the high priorities that the board adopts through the VTrans process. Next slide. One of the things that's a little unique to how the pipeline runs is traditionally you'll scope a study out from beginning to end at the very beginning. The problem is you don't have a full understanding of the problems, and you don't have a full understanding of the potential solutions that you'll need to test. And so a lot of contingency has to be built into that scope of work for the study. The approach we've taken with Project Pipeline is to break the studies up into 3 main phases. And phase 1 to understand what are the issues, what are we trying to solve, what are the causes to those issues, what's happening at the intersection, what are the access management challenges, so on and so forth. And then once you have that information from phase 1, you can develop a very targeted phase 2 scope of work, which is getting into your alternatives development and testing. You're going to know what type of analytical tool is going to be best. Is it Synchro? Is it CoreSim? Is it VisSim? So you're able to have a much more targeted and specific phase 2 document because it's informed essentially from your findings in phase 1. And the same goes for phase 3. Phase 3 is the end of phase 2, you identify your preferred alternative. You've gone through public engagement. And phase 3 is really that final polish. So phase 2 informs the scope of work for phase 3. It's identified the risk that we want to address from a cost standpoint. And so we're able to, in my opinion, have been able to do 45 studies in right around a year using this phased approach, and about 75% of them have resulted in projects being submitted for this round of Smart Scale. So we feel this sort of funnel approach, phase 1 through phase 3, really worked, and is something we plan on taking forward with several other study programs, but particularly with the Project Pipeline. Next slide. I'm going to go through this real quick. When we say performance-based planning, and many of you have probably seen this slide from me in the past, if your check engine light comes on, would you immediately sort of say, I need a new engine, or I need to go buy a new car? And so similarly, when there's a congestion need or a safety need, do we want our knee-jerk reaction to be, I need to widen the roadway, or I need to build new roadway? So very similarly, next slide, what we're trying to do with performance-based planning is when an issue comes up, the first step should always be to understand what the problem is, what is causing the issue. And once you have a good understanding of that, you're able to develop and test a wide range of solutions. And maybe a new car or a new engine is needed, but oftentimes you'll find that there's other more targeted, more cost-effective things you can do. And that really allows us to accomplish more, to solve more problems with the same amount of money using this performance-based planning approach. Next slide. So really what guides us, if it's not broke, don't fix it. So you got to have a need. If you can prevent the breakage from occurring, so that preserving and protecting assets and preventing the degradation of performance over time should be your next priority. If it is broke, is there ways that you can fix what you have? And then lastly, if you've exhausted those first three options, then look to build something new or to expand capacity. And so that's really the sort of mantra that we're trying to follow. Data is really key to allowing us to more quickly get up and running. So what we've done through the pipeline is established a series of data dashboards that allow us to mine the overwhelming amount of data that the state now has access to, whether it's safety or travel time, speeds. There's a host of data sources that we now have access to. And the first step in Project Pipeline was sort of standing up these dashboards that allow us to consistently analyze the information. And these were web-based tools that were available to the study teams where we could go in and we're all looking at the same information. It's visualized in the same manner. Next slide. And so these are just some examples, some screenshot examples. As I mentioned, we start with that sort of VTrans need. We've got needs in different categories, whether it's bike access, capacity preservation, and we're going to be walking y'all through some examples here, both in the Bristol area as well as in Stanton. Another key thing with the pipeline program before I turn it over is, developing templates so that we're not reinventing the wheel. So each step in the process, we've got a series of templates. So what you're seeing here is that phase one deliverables where we're framing the issues. And we created templates that allow us to have consistent icons and symbology and colors so that if you're looking at a study in Bristol versus a study in Nova, they've got a similar look and feel, and we're spending less time designing the deliverables. Here's the deliverable for the traffic and safety group, looking at those issues and sort of framing the problems and the issues at the intersections and along the corridors from a safety standpoint. And then reliability, transit, and TDM needs, sort of taking stock of existing services and infrastructure. And next slide. Then getting into your brainstorming of potential solutions and fixes. So this starts to get into your phase two, where you're testing and developing alternatives. And so I feel like this template process has also allowed us to streamline the time it takes to develop these, as well as have some consistent look and feel on the other end. Next slide. I've already went over the phases. So where we're at in this initial inaugural run of the project pipeline is we are in phase three with 45 studies that we did across the Commonwealth. They were selected by the East Commonwealth Transportation Board members for each district. They were based on the VTrans needs. And we're essentially in phase three for most of those now, where we're finding cost estimates and sketches. So this is a process that will go through every 2 years. The hope is next round we'll be able to do more studies. But with that, I believe that's my last slide. I'm going to turn it over to the next group to actually walk y'all through some examples that we've done throughout the state. So I'm going to turn it over to Nathan.
Yeah, thanks, Chad. And like Chad mentioned, really performance-based planning is our goal, as part of the overall pipeline program. So What I'm going to talk about, Chad gave kind of the whole phased approach, but what we also identified in starting the program is very often we have projects that maybe go through the smart scale process or maybe have been studied previously, and either the costs are too high or there's really something going on where we need that performance-based approach. And so the example here that we've had an opportunity to support in the Nova district is in Loudoun County on Route 7. Many of you are probably familiar with this area. But what you can see in the project area, Loudoun County submitted a project in round 4 of Smart Scale, and it was actually the #1 statewide scoring project in congestion mitigation, scored a very, very high benefit score of 54. So shows we have some real benefits to this project. However, the cost came in at about $130 million. So due to the high cost, it fell out of scoring and was not selected in round 4. So where we've seen that need that Chad discussed with the VTrans needs and some high priority projects, we want to come back in and take that approach of, extending the engine. Like maybe we've identified we need the transmission, but are we able to work with the existing transmission? Do we need a different kind of transmission? It's a big repair, but how can we do it in the most cost-effective manner possible? And knowing that cost is a big deal. So as we move ahead, you'll see that this corridor has some very high traffic in that 60,000+ ADT. So it's just getting beyond the capacity that we have here. So we have identified that big need, but where are we going with that? And so again, if you're familiar, just some key components. This is where the Dulles Greenway intersects. We have a large inflow of traffic that heads, around the Leesburg area and over to Western Loudoun County. And so this really showed that need, and this project was very important. So we didn't really need the phase 1 in this case. We really were able to kind of start with phase 2 and employ that approach to really get started. So as following slides will show, we really dig in deep here. We go kind of page by page of our concept plan to kind of provide a value engineering as well as that performance-based approach. So, wherever we're making improvements, we're ensuring that they're providing the benefit from a smart scale scoring and, meeting a need, and then seeing if there's alternatives that we can employ. So you can see we're starting here on the western side of the project. And one of the things we looked at right away was if we shifted the previous concept of just standard widening and we looked at widening to the median throughout most of the project, that was going to save us big impacts in the right-of-way field. And I'll show you some dollar figures when we get towards the end of that. But that was something we were able to identify where, hey, if we're able to shift our approach a little bit, there's very likely to be some cost savings. And so moving ahead here, you'll see we kind of carry this through. So you can see we're really looking at, just location by location, improvement by improvement. What's driving the cost? Where are there risks? Where are there high ticket items that are being built into our estimate that we can provide this upfront planning preliminary engineering approach to come up with some ideas? And so, from this slide, you can see where we were avoiding impacts to the W&OD trail bridge, big cost savings there. Again, continuing our widening, identifying where our noise barriers are going to be so we can get a better quantity for those and ensure that our risks aren't very high in terms of miles and miles of noise barrier wall that might be required. And the last one that shows kind of the project, you can see here, we even get down where we needed a little bit of survey. We're looking under the bridges. How do we avoid pier impacts? Just gives kind of a specific example of where we're getting to, not the nitty gritty, but trying to dig down into the details to make sure we fully, addressed everything we need, but nothing that we don't in what's needed for the project. And the last one here to wrap up will show where through this process and the performance-based planning approach that we used in pipeline, we're able to see about 12 to 20%, pretty significant savings for this type of project, where we're likely going to be able to lower the ask for the project even a few years later by $20 to $30 million. So being able to come to that 12-20% savings is going to be a real big benefit in how well it could compete for funding going forward. And so I won't go, line by line, but just kind of highlighting from our previous slides where we eliminated bridge impacts, reduced right-of-way impacts, looked at different ways of widening, improved our typical section where we needed to identify waivers and exceptions that might help us out and reduce our estimates by a few $1 million. We're working with the district to make sure they're in agreement and that's a good idea and makes sense so that going into round 5 of Smart Scale, we've got just a really solid baseline of what's going to solve the problem, as well as a good overall concept that's going to compete well. So that's just a good example of performance-based planning, where we've taken previous projects, and I'll turn it over to Blake and Rob to talk about some of theirs.
Thank you, Nathan. For those of you that may not know who I am, my name is Blake Ayler. I'm with the Virginia Department of Transportation, and I'm the Bristol District Planning Manager. I'll also have with me Mr. Rob Prunty with Kimley Horn, and we have been partners in crime on this project. It's been a fun one to go through. We are now, as Chad has mentioned, starting to work our way into phase 3 of this project. So we will jump into this example within the Bristol District. So as you see on your screen, we're looking at an area along Interstate 81 that is just off of exit 19, which is just outside of the Abington town limits. For a lot of people may know where that area is located. This is a heavily traveled corridor. In and around our ADT is around 27,000 vehicles. So that is a high number along this stretch. We have a lot of generators within this region, being the Walmart Supercenter, Lowe's, Dunkin' Donuts, in regards to a medical facility, and a number of other items here that attract over 9,000 commuters daily to this location. So knowing that, digging into some of the data that Chad talked about as we begin to dig into these projects and really take a look at it, we start to pull in some of what makes this corridor have issues with its transportation network, and how can we solve those problems. So as we start to look, as Chad mentioned, into the VTrans priority, everything within the Commonwealth starts with our transportation plan. So we will always look to VTrans to guide us to the areas that we have issues. Within this region, we'll see that it is severe for priority 1, very high for bicycle, congestion, capacity preservation, and safety. Within our district specific, this region ranked number 1 within a multitude of categories, and one that we are very familiar with. Similar to the example that Nathan gave, this location has been submitted in previous rounds of Smart Scale at the intersection of US 11 and US 58, which I know Rob will dive into a little bit deeper. But it had not been successful. We knew a performance-based planning initiative needed to occur here in order for us to really dive into those specific issues that are occurring. So down at the bottom of the screen, you'll see that this is a heat map for our hot spots for crashes. Total crashes along this corridor in the 5-year span that we looked at between 2015 and 2019 is 138. There are a high number of rear end and angle crashes along this corridor. One of the issues with the corridor is the high number of access points. A lot of turning vehicles along the corridor, and this can result in increased travel times, and it can really hit home to the reliability issues that we see along this corridor being as congested as it is. So given the proximity to the interstate and being able to make those movements onto and off of the interstate, and with all of the development that has occurred, given the large intersection at US 11 and US 58, we begin to see that our travel times along this corridor are not where they should be. Consistently, they're below 20 miles per hour during the peak periods. So that is both AM between 6 and 9, PM between 3 and 6. Anywhere that you see red, we're below 20 miles per hour during those time periods, and that can cause, again, congestion issue, travel time reliability issues along this corridor. As I hit on a few minutes ago, access management is a key component, I believe, in a lot of what we do. And I think if you look at it holistically and try to dive into it, those issues can be solved along the corridors within the Commonwealth. Now, this area is certainly has its issues. We have 28 total driveways and/or curb cuts along this small section that you are looking at. 13 of those will be on the south side of the corridor. 15 of those are along the northern side of the corridor. We also have closely spaced signalized intersections. And then obviously all the driveways along the corridor, they contribute to that delay and to that congestion that we see. So you'll see we have 3 signalized intersections along the corridor, which again can contribute to some of those issues that we are seeing. 6 full access 4-legged intersections, 6 full access T unsignalized intersections, 4 right in, right out, or those are semi-restricted access driveways. So the big issue as you look along this corridor, not only is access points, et cetera, but a lot of these driveways in today's standards are not in accordance with VDOT's access standards. So that is something we want to take into an account as we look across the corridor and try to look at ways that we can alleviate the issues that the citizens are seeing within this section. With that being said, that's an introduction into this pipeline project within the Bristol district. I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Prunty with Kinley Horn for him to dive a little bit deeper into the project.
Thanks, Blake. Appreciate it. So as you mentioned, I'm Rob Prunty and worked with Blake and Chad and Nathan and others over the past 9 months on this project. One of the things that we looked at was how to group some of the potential solutions that kind of fall into the line of the model that Chad went over earlier, and especially to look at opportunities for innovation. So we looked at some access management alternatives to address some of those issues you heard Blake mention in the area that's shown in the bubble there with alternative 1 over on the western side of the corridor. On the eastern side of the corridor, where it says alternative 2A and 2B, we looked to try to see were there things that we could do, noting that feedback we got from the public indicated well in excess of 55% of the public was concerned about both traffic operations and safety, and looking for those kind of improvements in the area. So the intersection there at Route 11 and 58, we looked at some different options for how we might be able to allow for safer and more effective operating conditions in that area. And then the 2 areas that you see, alternative 3 and 4, was taking a different approach of looking at some potential relocations to help spread out the number of junctions and the amount of traffic that was involved in these larger angle movement interactions along the 58 corridor. So a couple of different options there corridor wise. So on the next slide, you'll see here, these are the different kind of things that we looked at. So looking at some potential for limiting movements, especially angle movements, to address some of those angle crashes that Blake was mentioning under alternative 1, with some access management on that left side near Marengo Road. The 2 alternatives that kind of came to the top based on some of our preliminary assessments, we're looking at some modification of the intersection to provide modification of the channelized right turn that's out there today that can sometimes cause both some safety and unexpected driver expectation issues, as well as looking at a potential roundabout. And in some areas of the Commonwealth, folks are not used to roundabouts. And one of the things that we look at each time that we consider treatments that might help solve some of the issues out there is there an unsignalized option with an innovative intersection that could work? And the department actually has a policy to always consider whether a roundabout is something that would be feasible. A couple of the other alternatives you see there that I was mentioning are the 2 potential corridor improvements where we would look at some sort of realignment or combining of roadways. And so what I'd like to do is just do a quick walkthrough of each one to show you kind of how we looked at this and then what were some of the pros and cons of each. Alternative 1 that we looked at, the access management, Blake mentioned a number of driveway openings, and this is not only a problem for vehicular traffic, but also you saw on one of the previous screens, bicycle related issues were a high need and a high priority as identified by VTrans. And part of that is because there are so many curb cuts to navigate through as a non-motorized user of the corridor. It's really not conducive and friendly to active transportation. And so were there ways to channelize and maybe consolidate certain angle movements and have folks have a little bit better understanding of utilizing some of the more significant roadway intersections that we'll show in a moment to make some of those left turns, angle movements, and in and out of some of these driveways. So a right in, right out access solution was proposed in this area, and then looking at extending the median in order to prevent movements from going across and creating the potential for more angle or turning accidents. In looking at the area a little bit further to the right there on our previous diagram, we got this option to remove channelized right turn. I mean, one of the things that that we did here on occasion is folks that were coming from 11, kind of on the right-hand side of your screen, and kind of whipping around, getting onto the US 58 corridor, and they really come very quickly around the corner, and you've got people navigating in and out of driveways just a little bit further to the west of there, for instance, at the Highlands Animal Hospital and locations beyond, and then folks that would quickly make a turn onto the 58 corridor and then shotgun across to make a left further down. So if those folks were channelized and brought to the traffic signal instead, perhaps the opportunity for a safer maneuver and to allow for people to get in and out of some of those driveways further to the left of your screen would be done so in a more orderly and perhaps safe manner. Looking further, as I mentioned, that innovation option, a roundabout was considered. What you'll note here is does require quite a bit of right-of-way take with some adjacent parcels, and then a stormwater detention area would result in some notable impacts to the adjacent land use that's out there today. But we did want to take a look at it to see what would be the benefits from a safety and operations perspective. If we take a look at for these first couple of alternatives, some of the pros and cons of each, what we found is that there were some minor improvements in terms of delays on some of the minor streets that were intersecting along 58 and 11. And we did reduce the number of conflict points, but we did see, because of those right turns, that we would introduce additional U-turns further down for people that would need to hang a right, go down, and then make a U-turn to head back to the direction they were going because of the restrictions of right in, right out. So we did see some increases in delays on the main corridor at the signal there at US 11, which was something that people were concerned about. The alternative 2A with that channelized right turn, there were some improvements, but we also saw some drawbacks in terms of what it did to the demand at the signal itself for stopped movements and the competition for green time. We did see some improvements in some sight distance, which would help on the safety side. But anytime you're bringing a channelized turn back to an intersection, you will see the potential for some additional delays. So our conclusion was that these improvements in and of themselves, while addressing safety, did not address all of the issues of capacity preservation and safety that were highlighted by Blake in the beginning. So we took a look at a couple of other options. Like I said, that roundabout, it was something that we took a look at in terms of the delays related to upstream intersections, because you always have the danger of queuing spilling back from one intersection to the other. You don't want to lock up the roundabout, and at the same time, you don't want to jam up the upstream signal because of people waiting to get into the roundabout with an appropriate gap. So we found that it performed with some reduced delays. There were moderate queues in the area, and one of the things we were most concerned about was the queuing going back to that upstream signal a little bit further to the left at Falcon Place that would have a negative impact on both. So the biggest concern that we had out of this one was just the amount of land that was impacted in the right-of-way and relocations that would be required. So taking a look at some of the other options, the option 3 that we looked at, kind of an unusual approach would be to look at this Falcon Place, where you see kind of in the middle of your screen next to the McDonald's where it intersects today, and seeing if we could relocate it further closer to the area where the signal is with Route 11, and have a more conventional 4-way signal there that might help break up some of the demand for turning movements there in an area where we've got a lot of access management issues. So in looking at some of the issues that we saw as we analyzed this, like if you can go to the next slide for me, thank you. So by taking those volumes away and diverting them, it certainly helps improve some of the issues that we were seeing with competition for gaps in availability for turning in and out of some of these places like the gas station, the McDonald's, and the bank. And by moving the roadway so that it's more aligned with Route 11 on the right-hand side of your screen, it did allow us to eliminate a northbound phase of the road that you see there right adjacent to McDonald's. So going from a 4-leg to a 3-leg at that particular intersection was helpful in looking at helping some of the reduction in delays, and the number of conflict points total was reduced. But we really didn't see much improvement overall, as it was like moderate increases as it related to delays that we might see at the 1158 intersection, because we were funneling more traffic through on the left-hand side there as 58 curves back around. So taking a look at the other option that I mentioned for realignment, this one would involve taking Lee Highway, Route 11, and pulling it in so that it intersected more at a right angle, got a little bit better spacing in that area, and we were able to get rid of having a signal there. You can see up at the top where instead we would cul-de-sac the existing intersection and still provide access to those businesses, but the main way to get between Route 11 and 58 would be relocated, provide a little more spacing between signalized intersections, and help with progression along the corridor by doing so. So in then taking a look, you can go to the next slide, please. So in taking a look at putting it all together, we took this out to the public through a survey online with our partner MetroQuest that showed all these different options out there, and then asked the public to weigh in. And we also coordinated with a lot of local agencies. And here's one of the big benefits of this Project Pipeline program. Through talking with folks on the ground there that live and breathe both the land use and future potential economic growth in the area, we found that some of the roadway relocation that we were looking at for that Falcon Place Boulevard realignment, where it would go to where the signal is that's got the X through it, it really caused some issues with both some future land use, as well as that was proposed in that area, as well as some potential concerns for the Lowe's that's in that south bottom left corner that you see of your screen, and the businesses that are out there today. And that was really a concern to consider. And sometimes the partnership with the local departments, with the local officials, and with the locality in general can inform your decision making to make sure that you've got the best mix of your land use planning, your transportation, and the interaction between. So we ended up looking at kind of a combination of a couple different things, scaled down to one preferred alternative we're carrying forward. You'll see in the upper left some of those access management options that I talked about that address some things specific to the areas you get closer to the interchange, and then the cul-de-sacing of the Route 11 intersection that's out there today, rather than going with a roundabout, and the relocation of Route 11 shown in yellow here on the bottom of your screen. And we really work to try and minimize impacts to adjacent properties, and we'll refine in phase 3 that you heard Chad mention the efforts to make sure that we have the best project with the least amount of risk in terms of things that could cause the project to be more expensive, to have greater impacts, or to increase and jeopardize the schedule. So we did our best to try and avoid some of the adjacent water features in terms of adjacent stream and some residential areas nearby to minimize the amount of takes in that area. So a high-level overview of what we considered when we were working on this project in a rural area, based on coordination, collaboration with the locality, as well as some feedback through vetting some of these alternatives in a virtual environment with the public. I'll stop there and turn it back over wrap up on this. Blake, anything else you want to say before we move on?
Yeah, I'd like to, Jillian, for yourself and APA Virginia, we'd like to thank you all for giving us this opportunity to come in and show off what Project Pipeline is, what it can do for the Commonwealth and for the localities within the Commonwealth. Performance-based planning is key today, and it's more so key, not just in transportation planning, but I truly feel in everything that we do. So we wanted to show this off. I thought it would go just a little bit longer. We went back and forth on these slides a couple of times. So with that being said, we would be more than happy to open it up for questions for myself, Rob, Nathan, or Chad, if anyone were to have any.
Thank you, Blake. I do see that we have one question that has been submitted by an anonymous attendee. If anyone would like to answer this, I can go ahead and read it. And I do apologize for any background noise. But an anonymous attendee asks, it sounds like project pipeline studies can establish a planning level foundation for an EPA level environmental analysis. Does the pipeline study approach encourage planning and environmental linkages, such as high level analysis, studies such as community impacts, environmental justice, and indirect cumulative impacts?
Hey,
Chad, would
Blake,
you like to tackle that?
I'd be more than happy to. Yeah, I'll take a stab at that. So we do engage with the environmental division and environmental staff. So yes, we very much develop these studies so that there's that planning and environment NEPA linkage, so that if the project moves forward and gets funded and requires some level of NEPA, there is some preliminary initial analysis that's been done as part of the pipeline study that can sort of kickstart that NEPA process. So we do look at potential impacts. Are there things that we need to look at from a risk or contingency standpoint? Because this is taking things a little bit beyond, that phase 3 takes a little bit beyond your traditional planning study, and that we're starting to get into some of the preliminary engineering. We want to understand, right away utility and survey impacts, but a big component of that risk assessment is what are environmental issues that we need to be aware of and that we need to look at, are there ways to mitigate? Because ultimately, if a project can't be permitted, that's something that we want to identify early in the process, or we can make adjustments to the alignment or what we're recommending to minimize those impacts. So that is very much a part of the study process, and something that we're trying to do more of at the planning level, so that it doesn't get tripped up, once it gets funded.
Alrighty, and I'm seeing a couple more questions come in. Someone asks, how long did the example study take?
So I know right now for ours in Bristol, I know, Chad, we've been going on this now for what, about 8 months? Is that right, around in there?
Yeah, I think we started, most of the 45 studies statewide started in earnest. I want to say it was around August of last year. So yeah, it's been about 8 or 9 months. So that, then that's sort of a testament to having this phased approach. I think has helped developing templates, so that there's 6 consultant firms that are helping us with this across the state. And developing those templates allows less time and resources to be spent on how to present the materials, and more time just doing the analysis and then plugging it into the template. So I think our ability to do 4 studies, 5 in each district over a span of 8 or 9 months to help get things ready for this round of smart scale. I don't know that it would have been done that quickly had we had taken a more traditional approach.
Alrighty, and a question from Hannah Twaddell, and I do apologize if I'm mispronouncing the last name. How do you want the project? Sorry, go ahead.
No, go. I know Hannah. I have Hannah. Good to hear your name.
Well, Hannah asks, how do you want the project pipeline study process to improve and evolve in the coming years?
Oh, that's a great question. And I'll let Blake and Rob jump in. I think we need to, I would like for us to start the studies sooner. It's been a little bit of a photo finish here. We got a little bit of a late start when the program got stood up and approved by the board. So one of the lessons learned for this upcoming round would be, you know, once the scores are released for this round of Smart Scale in January, is to start identifying, work with each district, work with each board member to start identifying the next batch. I think that'll help out tremendously. Doing more public engagement in phase one. We were in the middle of the pandemic and we were like, why don't we just wait? We'll wait until phase two when we've got some stuff for folks to react to. And I think having some public engagement in phase one, when you're framing what the problems and issues are, and you can bounce that off the public and the surrounding community for them to tell you where you got it right or where maybe you got it wrong. I think that's a lesson learned of trying to, you know, and I think starting the studies earlier will allow us to front load more public engagement in the first phase when you're diagnosing what the issues are. I'd like to make the dashboards more widely available, not just for pipeline, but sort of across the board, because I think that's a really good way of, you know, framing all the data in a consistent manner rather than spending a lot of times, you know, doing analysis. We can just pull this information, pull the safety data, put it in the dashboard. It visualizes it for you. It shows it to you on a map, and it allows you to more quickly be able to go in and start actually understanding the problems and developing the potential solutions, and less time sort of massaging the data at the beginning. So those are a couple of my observations. Nathan and Blake may have some others.
I think you hit on them, Chad. I think with every program we have, when it's in its inaugural run, we always come back. Chad's group's great to come back and say, okay, let's have a Q&A after the end of this and see what things could we do better, what things do we want to avoid next time. And I know we're just now going through that process. We're collecting feedback from each district, and Chad hit on a few of those a little earlier. Public feedback is probably going to be sought next time. I know Chad mentioned, and everyone on here, I think, has had to fight through this. During the pandemic, it was very challenging to initiate this amount of studies, 5 per district, throughout the Commonwealth, and get through the public information part. So we're going to, I think we're going to retool that just a little bit and change it up next time. And Chad mentioned starting just a little bit earlier. I know we're trying to get by the finish line in order for Smart Scale for these projects to hopefully go in and get funded. So I know, like I said, with everything, there will be small tweaks and changes made to it in order for us to learn from any mistakes from the beginning or areas where we see we could have grown and made better in the future. So I think more to come, especially with this being a biannual process. I will say, shameless plug for transportation and mobility planning division within VDOT TMPD, pathways for planning. If there are localities, be it counties, towns, cities on the call, check out Pathways for Planning. You can sign up for an account once it's activated. All of the data that VDOT has, we've been compiling it to try to get it to our localities in one centrally located source. That has now been done in Pathways for Planning. It is a very robust planning tool. Everything inside of there, we've been working very hard from a VDOT standpoint and an Office of Intermodal Planning and Investment standpoint to build that up, to give you all these tools and resources at your fingertips as you begin to think about transportation projects, if it's at a locality level, you know, to build off of VTrans. And so definitely a neat tool for you all to take a look at.
I'll just build on a couple things you all said on the time. We'd like to definitely get this into a cyclical, which I think you used that word, Blake, you know, getting localities and everybody thinking about this earlier, you know, to fit in with the Smart Scale timeline. That way, you know, a lot of people, we get done with one round, it's like, oh, great, you know, we got that finished, but, you know, we want to definitely get that cycle of time And then also, I think we've talked about too, smart scale is obviously very important, but we'd love to encourage people through the pipeline to also think about things like TAP and HSIP and revenue sharing and other programs, so that to use Chad's term, investment strategy can be something very diverse. We don't want project pipeline to be exclusively married to smart scale, which is something we're working on through phase 3 as well. So, but I think you guys did a great job covering some items.
And we have another question that I think is somewhat related, and Blake touched on a little bit, but if anyone would like to elaborate further, Ellen Cook asks, for project pipeline, is the public comment all handled through MetroQuest, or have there been meetings as well? Can you comment on how well you think the public understands the options when they take the online questionnaires?
Chad, do you want me to speak to this one a little bit?
Yeah, take a stab.
Sure. So it's an excellent question, and part of probably our continuous quality improvement process for project pipeline. The majority of the feedback, this initial round from the public at large was through MetroQuest, and the surveys were set up intentionally to be very accessible to the public in terms of the language that was used, using layman's terms, coming at it without a bunch of techno jargon, and making it as intuitive as possible. In one of the other districts in Hampton Roads, we did have a request for some public engagement during phase 2 by means of discussions with some of the local either county board of supervisors or city councils. And so we did engage with some of the citizens in that manner. In 2 nights, Blake and Chad and I will be hosting a public information meeting down in the Bristol district for one of the projects under the Bristol portfolio of Project Pipeline, because we really felt like, based on the feedback that we had received from the survey, that we reached a lot of people who found out about the project and the survey through social media, Facebook, and other methods like that. But we really wanted to reach out to folks who might be affected on the ground through potential redundant driveway closures or roadway consolidation at intersections. And so we are having that in-person public information meeting as part of phase 3 coming up. I think back to Chad's point that you heard earlier, I think a way that we will probably look to retool this a little bit for the next round is getting more of that perhaps in-person public engagement. It was really tough for the team to gauge in a COVID world the uncertainty of whether we'd ever have the opportunity to be meeting in person again or not. So we kind of took it with the looking at the risk of not being able to gauge at all, to go the virtual route for the majority of the project interface in the first go round. Although I will say there were a number of interim level briefings that were held across the Commonwealth, depending on the district and the project, with some of the localities, either elected officials or agency executives, in either face-to-face briefings or virtual meetings, not unlike this one, in order to try and get as much feedback of local concerns as possible. And that's something we'll certainly look to optimize and maximize on for the next round.
Okay, we have another question from an anonymous attendee. Does Project Pipeline Studies provide multimodal solutions? In other words, does it look into other aspects beyond highways like bicycle and pedestrian safety, transit solution, and freight related solutions as well?
Yes. It's definitely looking at it multimodally. I guess I would add, and Blake, if you could go back to that one screen that showed like VTrans needs, I think it was around slide 10 or 11 or 12. So that's one thing that allows us to get a quicker start, is a lot of analytics go into the VTrans need process. There's a public engagement, engaging with the localities and the PDCs. And so this really sort of drives us moving forward. You can see here in this specific example, bicycle access, anywhere it's low or above, that means it's going to be something that we're going to look at. If it's got a none, then that means it was not identified as a priority and is typically going to be something that we're not going to look at unless we get information during that engagement phase of something that's not reflected in the data. So all of these studies, if you look at them, and I encourage y'all to go to the VA Project Pipeline website, you'll see a heavy focus on making sure that we're not just looking at highways, but we're looking, across the board at travel demand management, transit, bike ped improvements, safety for all users across all modes.
Chad, I'll add to that. We had 3 teams at VDOT, and as part of this process, we had safety is team 1. I may get these confused, but safety is team 1, congestion is team 2, and team 3 was made up of the Department of Rail and Public Transit. So DRPT had their own team within each of the studies within the district. So rail, transit, TDM needs, things of that nature were looked at in detail by the DRPT team to determine what types of recommendations need to be put forward.
Okay, and I just want to note that we do still have quite a few questions coming in, and if we do not get to them in the next 5 minutes, we will, of course, have the opportunity to submit questions, and we will be sending out resources as well in a follow-up email. But for now, submitted by an anonymous attendee, can you describe how the projects are selected for pipeline studies? I'm not sure to the extent at which this was touched on within the presentation already, but perhaps if there was anything else additional to add.
So Chad, I can give an example if you want in Bristol.
Yep.
So as we prioritize it, and the central office, part of Chad's group within the Office of Intermodal Planning and Investment, we have a VTrans team that went through all of the state's needs that we had listed within our state's transportation plan, and they prioritized those needs based on their severity. So on the top part of this graphic, you see priority 1, 2, and 3. If they were ranked as a priority 1, so Bristol District, for example, we took all priority 1 locations inside of our district. We dove into the metadata to look and see what was causing it to be a priority 1, and we calculated the scores up, and we ranked ours from worst to least, priority 1 locations. We then went through and removed old study locations, old funded project locations, things of that nature. We went back to what was left over, and we went through and we took our top 5. And at that point, this was the number 1 location that we're showing here within the Bristol district via those scores. So very much a data-based system, and I'm pretty confident in saying each district took a very similar process. In the end, it had to be approved by each district CTB member and signed off on. There could have been other projects that could have came in and out as long as they contained a priority 1 segment or location.
Yeah, and that's very consistent from my experience with the other districts. The districts working with DRPT sort of made initial recommendations. Here's things that we think make sense. And then the board members reviewed that and then made a decision on, all right, these are the 5 studies that'll move forward. But most of the districts did get input from the affected localities, after the priorities were sort of identified, to just make sure that there was local and regional support to move forward with some of those studies.
Okay, and I think we have time for one more question. An anonymous attendee asks, how do we get an account for pathways to planning? The website does not appear to allow one to create an account.
Sure. So on pathways for planning, real quick, I'm gonna if you'll go over here, you can create by clicking contact us and send this in, and I believe you will do the request access here. You will fill this out and submit it, and they will email you back. And then at that point, you'll be able to come back to this website, fill this in, and log in for the first time.
Perfect. Since that was so quick, I think we do have time for the very last remaining question. Another one from Hannah Twiddell. What's the relationship between pipeline studies and GAP studies, Growth Accessibility Planning Program?
That's a good question. I think the pipeline studies are more project solution oriented, getting something ready to compete for funding, say at the local, regional, or state level. The GAP studies are really meant, and I'm speaking based on my very limited understanding, but I believe the GAP program is really providing more assistance at sort of the local comprehensive plan level, of being able to stand things up and have a local planning process that better integrates transportation and land use. That's my understanding, but I honestly would have to defer to Jatinder and his team to give more background on the GAP program, because I have very limited background knowledge. Blake, you may have a little bit more knowledge of that program than I do.
Yeah, I think you hit it, Chad. Unfortunately, within our district, we haven't had anyone to try to receive those funds yet or apply for that funding. We've certainly advertised it, but we haven't had anyone to go after it yet. But I believe you hit it right on. If you go to the Office of Intermodal Planning and Investments website, you will find a section for the GAP funds, and it will dive into and talk about what those funds are, what they can be leveraged for, and how they can be used.
All right, well, I think we had some really excellent questions, and thank you so much for a really great presentation. I appreciate everybody's time, and for those of you who joined us this afternoon. Again, this is recorded and will be posted on the chapter's YouTube. The link is in the chat. And a follow-up email with resources and more information will be coming soon, but I will say goodbye now. Thank you everybody for joining.